Okay, so hi, I'm Shock Exchange, and this is Trump and the GE, where we discuss policies that are important to the economy and the community. And I have, of course, with me Torian Mitchell, and we have a special guest today, future governor of Georgia, Al Bartell. And yeah, we're excited. We're excited to hear from Mr. Bartell as far as his background and his future plans for Georgia. Mr. Bartell, Governor, your background is so extensive and so impressive. I couldn't do it justice. So, why don't you give us a little bit about your background in your own words?
Yeah, I'm a deep Southern male. Grew up in the deep South in southeastern South Carolina, what we call the swampland. A lot of rivers and swamps and farm and the stories you hear about cotton and corn and tobacco and grass and snakes and horses and cows and pigs. All of that is what I grew up in, and I was one of the first wave of the integrated school systems in South Carolina. And so my 12th grade guidance counselor one day pronounced my whole country name. She said, Elbert Arthur Bartell, I got somebody I want you to meet. And it was an Air Force recruiter. And my whole world altered. I got a chance to see things and places that other people only read about. I am one of the last vestiges of the Vietnam era veteran. I went in during the fall of Saigon in the early 70s and got out after 8 years and used my GI Bill to go back to school, and I majored in business and conflict management. And so as a consultant or as working for organizations, my whole world was public engagement. Working with neighborhood leaders, community leaders, faith leaders, and small business leaders so that they would have a seat at the table in urban, suburban, and rural communities. I did that all over the southeast region of the nation. Landed here in Georgia about 30 years ago and started doing that as a professional, doing it as an activist, and doing it as an advocate. And then began to consider that one of the best ways to get a message out and before the people would be to become a candidate. A candidate has access to conversations that normal people does not have. A candidate can include people in ways that are unprecedented. And so I have run for mayor. I run for lieutenant governor of Georgia. I run for United States Senator of Georgia. And now, in the next election cycle, I'll be running for governor of Georgia as an independent candidate in the 2022 election cycle.
Okay, great. Well, Georgia has I don't know if you I'm sure you guys know, but Georgia has become national news. It's
It
become
has.
like I'm from Virginia, so Virginia dominated 24-hour news cycle over the past couple weeks, but
Yeah.
Georgia dominated 24-hour news cycle. You know, leading up. I mean, during the last election for governor and leading up to the presidential election and after the election, because obviously Stacey Abrams is making a lot of noise in Georgia. But when
Right.
I speak to relatives about Georgia, they were saying things like we have to resist Trump because
Yes.
of voter suppression. I guess potential voter suppression during the last governor election, where I
Exactly.
think I've been hearing stories that some of the voting booths didn't work or the voting machines didn't work in certain black districts, and I think that's what they were complaining about. And
Right.
Stacey Abrams was a surprise candidate. She did very well during the election, and she also helped. Well, I guess what they say turn Georgia blue
Yes.
for Biden, which is I wouldn't say unheard of, but I mean I'm from Virginia. Virginia's a red state. Biden
Yes.
won Virginia. He won North Carolina. He won Georgia.
Right.
I mean I thought it was sort of surreal. So could you sort of speak to sort of what's the political environment in Georgia? And I think I'm guessing you can sort of piggyback off some of that energy that Stacey Abrams has created for the past couple of years.
Yeah. Well, Stacey was the minority leader of the Georgia State House. She was tracking people and data, while other people were just tracking marketing. And the data showed her that the diversity of Georgia was becoming aware. You know, with the advent of Twitter and social media, the political marketing stakeholders couldn't hog the data anymore. They couldn't control the dialogue. They couldn't control the dispensing and the distribution of information. So Stacey Abrams saw that and began to consider using that to be in communication with people and give them a seat at the table. So when she started talking about how patterns of behavior and patterns of participation was going to change, she was looking at data and people while everybody else was just following traditional political marketing strategies. And when the vote came in, there was some irregularities with voting machine and voting patterns, but her prediction came true. The diversity in Georgia made itself known, and she almost won being the governor of the state of Georgia. And then 2 years later, that galvanized itself. And we had two United States senators elected from Georgia in an unprecedented way, carried the state for Joe Biden, and altered the base of power in Washington, D.C. And Stacey Abrams provided the leadership for that and was at the forefront of that. But now you have the advent of something called the Trump factor. And there's a growing measure of people who are interested in being an independent force in America as the alternative to the Trump factor. Stacey Abrams and the other leadership have now galvanized the Democratic Party to communicate the values of the Democratic Party, and that's what they should be doing. But somebody has to consider being the alternative to the Trump movement in America. I've taken on being the alternative to the Trump movement here in the state of Georgia.
Okay, it's interesting you mentioned Trump because, you know, resist Trump was a lot of what we heard during the presidential election, and
Right.
it was a narrative that, you know, that played extremely well, sort of like hope and change and keep
Right.
America great, so on and so forth. Resist Trump
Right.
was something that rang out, particularly in the black community,
Right.
and it seemed like it was an anti-Trump vote as much as a pro-Biden vote and a pro-Kamala Harris vote. That resist Trump narrative didn't work in Virginia.
That's correct, it didn't.
So I'm curious if I'm assuming Stacey Abrams will run again. I'm not sure, but if someone comes out with the resist Trump narrative, it may ring hollow, and it may be an opportunity for someone like yourself to come in with someone who has the experience and can talk policy and convey policy to the public and how it could potentially help change people's lives.
That's accurate. The resist Trump strategy will not work again in Georgia because it was also grounded in the background of resist racism. So the political marketing stakeholders of the Trump stakeholders began to consider, we got beat because people came out against racism. We may get beat again, but it won't be because people coming out and push racism. So the Trump machine has galvanized a black male to run for U.S. Senate and a black male to run for governor on the Republican ticket. Now, these are not two, quote-unquote, high-end African-American males with high-end backgrounds. These are two brothers who've been up against a lot of stuff, been accused of violent communication, been accused of mistreating women, been accused of a lot of things that a lot of black men have been accused of. And you got the Trump Republican reference point of putting these two men up at the top of the ticket. So they're clear. They might get beat again, but it won't be because of racism. So we're not going to be able to use the resist Trump factor. We're going to have to come out with some policies that speak to the everyday person. And the Democratic Party is going to have to move a long ways to do that because they are clear that they now have a high-end media management message that is not going to save the day in the 2022 election cycle.
Okay.
But that's the excuse me. Sorry, Ralph. If I may interject, governor or governor-elect, we're gonna call you, because I thought you've been saying a couple of interesting things, and really, it all comes down, and I think I mentioned on air before. We kind of chat offline so often. Sometimes these conversations begin to get murky, but however, it's reminiscent because you talked about the data points that Stacey Abrams was able to take, right? Yeah. And it reminds me, and I don't know if you recall, I want to say that was around like circa sometime between 2012 and 2014. Koch brothers.
They're Koch brothers. Yeah.
Correct. Took a similar approach. In fact, this predates the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right?
Yeah.
Koch brothers essentially modeled what Cambridge Analytica simply took and utilized, and simply took data points to gerrymander districts and specifically around certain policies and voting patterns. We saw some of the first effects of it in North Carolina specifically.
That's correct.
So below the Mason-Dixon line. They were obviously targeting the South, as well, the South and Midwest, if I remember correctly, since it's been a while. Yeah. So I've kind of on and off watched this evolution of how voting patterns based on essentially based on that model. One of the first policies that we saw out of North Carolina, I don't know if you recall, but it was abortion.
Correct.
And we saw the reduction of the abortion clinics in both North Carolina and Texas, and it was a result. You can kind of call it a win for the Koch brothers because that model worked. So kind of fast forward to now. Is bringing up Stacey Abrams and then bringing up Trump. Essentially, what it sounds to me is that, they discovered that people are trackable, right? That voting patterns are trackable, right? Like golly gee, go figure, right? But what was interesting is the last piece. You stated about the two candidates. I did notice we kind of had a little chuckle at I believe Herschel Walker made his candidacy known, right? I said, okay, that's going to be an interesting one. But the thing about it, though. And I've said this before, and I think I've said it on the broadcast before. I've certainly said it offline plenty of times, that Trump actually missed an opportunity. And I was literally waiting for the last year for this to drop because we saw the criminal justice reform bill. And then prior to the criminal justice reform, we saw essentially what kind of looked like a toe in the reparations argument from the Trump administration.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I said, if this man wants to galvanize the black vote, all he has to do is simply say, I'm for reparations. I'm going to move forward with reparations, whether it actually happens or not, whether it happens through an executive order, which could be repealed through congressional order. But the point is that they literally were sitting on that key, right? And it seems like now that Trump, lost the vote, now all of a sudden going back to that period where he was surrounded by the pastors and surrounded by what's his name, Senator Tim
Scott.
Tim Scott, and he was buddy. So it seems like they are now looking at the data to call back to specifically black men. I think black women have a deep loyalty, and correct me if I'm wrong, but just looking at the exit polls over the last really 3 voting cycles, black women are deeply loyal to the Democratic Party.
Party.
You're right. You have some outliers, like Kim Klachich, for example, out of Baltimore.
Turner
I'm
up
escaping
in
the young
Ohio.
ladies.
Nina Turner up in
Correct.
Ohio.
Correct. But for the most part, they're deeply loyal to the Democratic Party.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like Trump is, looking at the most recent popular polls,
Right.
that he has a 40% chance of winning, which is like, wow, like
not starting from ground zero, is it?
No.
There you go. So, understanding that, I guess my question is, one, I guess the question was kind of, have you noticed that? And is that a part of your approach with your campaign moving forward? And then also, what is that? Because when I hear you speak, it kind of reminds me of Fannie Lou Hamer.
Yeah.
Because she was the bridge between, exactly, she was the bridge between the working class black folks, sharecroppers, the custodians, working class black people, and policy makers. So she was really the next level below the Dr. Martin Luther Kings.
That's right.
And getting to speak for real black folks that are often kind of overlooked. So understanding, because that's kind of what I hear, but I don't want to assume. So one, I guess the next part of that question is that the bridge you're looking to gap? And is a part of that bridge, if so, I guess specifically the black male vote?
Absolutely. It is the bridge that I'm looking to bridge, is that gap. A cornerstone of it is the black male vote. And here's why. We have more black males who are incarcerated than there are in college. The sentencing patterns for black males are stark. Black males and other males get arrested for the exact same thing. But when that sentencing comes, black males get hit harder. Our mental health, our physical health, any data point you pick, black males fall off of a cliff. So somebody should champion the world of the black male, and it has now become the opportunity to do that in the world of politics. The question is, do you have a candidate who's courageous enough to do that, and at the same time counteract the Donald Trump strategy, which is to hijack the world of the black male? And I'm willing to do both.
Right. So on that point, I mean, the Ahmaud Arbery case is coming up, and I would imagine it could be an opportunity to deliver that message, what you just said. That, I mean, I think whoever can, assuage fears that this is not going to continue in the state of Georgia, and as you got a lot of positive publicity for turning Georgia blue, has also been publicity over the Ahmaud Arbery case, and this could be an opportunity to hear the black male voice that we need to hear. Right. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And then the other point that Mitchell made was about the black working class. You know, there's a lot of black working class, black entrepreneurs, people who have felonies who, quote unquote, can't get a job. They don't experience being included in the Stacey Abrams brand of the political movement. They don't experience being included in the Joe Biden brand of the political movement. This is the same Joe Biden that orchestrated 3 strikes and you out, lock up black men as predators. This is the same guy. So this is the same guy who did not back entrepreneurship for African American communities. And so the working class, this is the same guy who could have pushed for $15 an hour for working folks a long time ago. He didn't when he was chairman of 3 committees. So the black experience, the work experience, is not as sold on the footprint of the Democratic Party. They just have not been able to have an independent conversation that could gain traction because we didn't have the communication framework. It was all controlled by the media. Now that we have access to social media and some of our own publications, there's an opportunity to alter that, and I think that opportunity is going to be here in Georgia.
Okay. Great. So it seems like you, as far as your messaging and the people you're trying to reach, I think it sounds, it sounds solid. I mean, the point about, we need to support black women and black girl magic. I'm surprised that black males don't feel included in that messaging.
Yeah.
But anyway.
That's why you on radio and TV, man.
Right. But anyway, so I want to pivot to the opiate epidemic. I think this could be while we're talking about issues. I think you're hitting a lot of key points, focusing on issues and the policy. I think this is an issue that has not really been that well covered by the corporate media. Again, the corporate media, what entertains the corporate media, what wets their palate, doesn't necessarily have to be our issues. If the people in the corporate media eat brie cheese and drink Earl Grey tea, don't mean we have to do it too. You know what I'm saying? So what's in the corporate media is CRT and critical race theory and the message about Trump not working anymore and what happened in Virginia. They're racist in Virginia. So that doesn't have to be our message. I think a key issue that the corporate media is not really covering is this sort of certain details of the opiate epidemic. As I spoke about last week about there seems to be a turning of the tide in terms of from a legal standpoint. That I wrote about how the AG for Nevada, Aaron Ford, could potentially lose $240 million by not signing on to the $26 billion opiate settlement that was offered back in June. And I don't think it's really, really well talked about in the corporate media. And at least 6 states didn't sign, including Georgia, West Virginia, Nevada, Washington State, Oklahoma. And I was curious, were you aware? I mean, I think Washington State passed on $540 million. Yeah. And they're in court now suing the opiate distributors. But, right. I mean, are you aware of how much Georgia's passed on? And is the public in Georgia really aware of this? I mean, because we do have an opiate crisis, and while we speak, Attorney General is in New York, in Texas, right. And in Arizona, Missouri, Alabama are handing out opiate checks right now, and for treatment prevention. I mean, do you know the amount that Georgia's passed on, and if the treatment prevention centers in Georgia are aware of it?
Well, the multi-trillion-dollar initiative that came off of Capitol Hill to quote-unquote empower states in opioid treatment. The mantra of the Republican establishment, particularly in the South, is to forward states' rights at all costs. And if they take that government money, government policy, federal government policy comes with it. The people on the street, the everyday person, is not aware of that. All they see is they resisted government money. And then the private sector are so ingrained in the design of media management campaigns that they're not worried about getting sued. That's like an expense going to dinner. They're willing to pay it because they're so ingrained in the political machinery. Your point is the everyday person is not aware of this. There is an opioid crisis because you can buy opioids now over the counter just like you can a piece of candy. Getting a prescription is like, writing your own pass on a hall ticket back in the day. You scribbled your own name on it because you got some off the teacher's desk. So the prolific distribution of opioids is a crisis, but it is now inside of the political marketing strategy. The private sector is driving the political marketing strategy, and then the theorists about states' rights at all costs is driving the power base. Those two reference points are in collaboration with each other. How do we begin to break it is the point you just pointed to. Very few people, if anybody, knows about it. So the question becomes, do you have a candidate? Can you find a candidate who's willing to talk about this, make this the mainstream of his or her campaign, and educate the American public? Georgia is the epicenter of that, and I'm willing to do that here in Georgia.
Well, the other thing is that the other side of the coin is that this does have a cost. This litigation does have a cost. I mean, there are courts. I mean, there are courts backed up with real issues. The plaintiffs have been told several times. They've been told by a judge in North Dakota, this isn't legal. This isn't illegal to sell. You can't sue drug companies for selling illegal drugs. They've been told by a judge in Connecticut, and then they've been told by a judge in California. Yep. Now, the judge in Oklahoma, Supreme Court of Oklahoma just overturned a verdict against Johnson & Johnson. Said that for various reasons that can you really prove? You haven't really proved that opiate manufacturers cause doctors to inappropriately prescribe opiates, and then can you prove that people who OD'ing on opiates were OD'd on prescription drugs versus drugs that were sold on the street? Then the manufacturers can't be held responsible for how someone uses their product after it's produced. And so it does have a cost, because I think now you hear a lot of people who are actually in chronic pain who can't get opiates because they've been cut back. The supply of opiates has been cut back by 60% since 2011. So now you have people who are in pain who some of them are committing suicide. They're in so much pain they can't get access to opiates, and their voices aren't being heard.
Right. Well, in America, you've always had the dichotomy between distributors and manufacturers or producers. So the first cut at the law was to come after the distributor, the mainline distribution houses, and then when it went to manufacturers, it can't be justified in court. You can justify the quote-unquote conscious intention of a distributor. You cannot justify in court. The law will never uphold the intention of a manufacturer, because all the manufacturer's intention is to manufacture it, not distribution. They don't have the data points for that, nor are they in the marketing game. So somebody got real smart and got real clear that if you language it in the world of a manufacturing, then the American bench will overturn it.
Okay. I mean, but we do have, I think the art world, it should reflect the times. And I think a lot of people are in pain. I think that's why we have an opiate crisis. And then we've talked about this on the show as well as offline, Tori and I. During the financial crisis, I think the investor class, like hedge fund managers, the real estate developers, and the private equity firms were taken care of. We have a stock market Dow at 36,000, but I think the average person is still in a lot of pain. I think even I think that's the opiate crisis speaks to that. I think the art world speaks to that. You hear rappers, particularly a lot of them coming out of Georgia, Lil Wayne, and Future rapping about drugs. Even Rick Ross, his new song called Outlaws, he raps about fentanyl. So he actually almost like fetishizes fentanyl. I mean, what do you say to young people? And rappers have a lot more influence than we do in a lot of ways. So what do you tell young people?
You have to have a message with two components. One is, because of the advent of pain and suffering, the government's going to step in and correct that pendulum. They're going to neutralize the impact of the distributors and the manufacturers and make opioids available to the public. The government is going to step in and do that. What we have to communicate to young people is, whether it comes from a person in a suit and a tie that's an elected official, or whether it comes from a person wearing a hoodie, harm and detriment is still harm and detriment. back in the day when we had communities where each one teach one, every neighbor take care of a neighbor. When we had that kind of community, we could communicate that. We don't have that kind of community as a structure now, but we have to put it back in place because of communication. Because we have 9-year-olds that can take one of these and operate a mass communication, we have the mechanism to now develop the capacity of our young people to understand that. But it's going to take leadership and not just some do-gooders who want to do the right thing.
Well, if I may, because you brought up a couple of good points. I definitely want to revisit the states' rights because I thought that was a pretty interesting, nearly shocking. I'm gonna be honest. When you even when it was first said, I was like, "Wow, that's a." I guess I'm a little bit surprised because even if you look outside of the propagandized media, I think intellectually it feels like we've progressed as a society to a certain point, right? Yeah. So to hear like states' rights that hardcore, like it doesn't matter about the people, I was like, wow, really? Like in 2021. So my question is although it really hasn't been publicized, McKesson was the one that outed outed the whole deal, but Alabama capitulated, specifically with Endo Pharmaceuticals, kind of behind the scenes. We have yet to hear what the actual deal was. We've speculated here on the show that we think it's pretty much for legal fees that Alabama has settled for. And it was, a day? No, it was the same day. It was the exact same day that the California ruling. So I think offline we kind of, put our tinfoil hat on and speculated that, maybe Alabama knew what was coming down the pipeline from California. It was like, hey, let's do a deal. But the reason I bring up Alabama, because I guess some of that same moxie tends to be associated with Alabama, with states' rights versus federal rights. Seeing that Alabama has kind of capitulated, do you feel that, when surrounding states like Louisiana, like Alabama, kind of swing one way on particular policy, does it have an impact on Georgia, or is Georgia just, hard charging all the way through, no matter who's on their side or not?
Well, it's going to definitely have an impact. Down in the Deep South, there's been an emerging battle between old money and new money. Old money, the states' rights, this us, y'all can't come here and tell us what to do. New money is about investors. So McKesson is more in the distribution business than they are the manufacturing.
Right.
So this is a major economic interest, investor-driven, called new money. In Alabama, new money has begun to be the bedrock of an economy that is growing and massive and investor-driven. And that's who's beginning to fund those campaigns, fund those leadership seminars, and fund those quote-unquote backroom deals. So yeah, new money's going to come to Georgia, no question, and all over the South. And part of this quote-unquote turning blue new wave is less about political theory and more about the new money has made its move on the Deep South. Here in places like Georgia, you have what's called the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. Out in Dallas, you got that massive stadium over where the Cowboys play. And then the King Dome down in Louisiana. That's foreign investment money. That's why it's called the Mercedes-Benz Stadium. And so the global stakeholders of investment has now picked the Southeast region for the multiple global investment to land. More headquarters, financial headquarters and otherwise, are moving here to Atlanta, New Orleans, Houston, and Birmingham. And that's going to change the vein of politics. Where it's going to, we thought it would land in the entertainment and sports industry, but because of COVID, it's landing in the public health industry. One of the leading distributors is McKesson, and that economy around that area is built all over the South, and it's going to use a pun, trump this whole states' right issue, and it won't be long.
Okay, I'm going to play a clip from you from Bob Ferguson, State AG of Washington State. He's suing McKesson and Cardinal Health and AmerisourceBergen for like $38 billion. He turned down $540 million. And his rationale seems to sort of reiterate what you just said about states' rights. I'm going to play a clip for you right quick.
Right.
Address the harm to our state. So for that reason, combined with the fact that there's no actual accountability for these companies, these reasons why I reject it.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. Because I'm curious, what do you think you can get out of a full-blown trial at this point that settlement offer could not give you? Is it just more money, or is there something else?
We do think there should be more money, but there is something else. And that something else is the many conversations I've had with Washingtonians since we filed this lawsuit. Parents who lost their child, for example, to opioid addiction. They say, hey, the money's important, but what I really want, Bob, is to be able to walk into a courtroom someday and see these individuals testify under oath about what they knew and when they knew it, why they made the decisions they did, and hear a jury or a judge say what they did was wrong, that they broke the law. So there is something more than money here at stake, and that word is, frankly, accountability, and that's what's lacking in that settlement.
Well, I want to
Okay, did y'all hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, so so he's basically saying that my constituents want their day in court.
Right.
And when he says my constituents, so when I first heard about the opioid epidemic, I thought it was laughable because some people want to get high. But when the crack epidemic came along, in fact, years ago, there was no media. There was no media firestorm. There were no state AGs, black or white.
Right.
Now, of the six states who didn't take the original deal and want to sue separately for more money, 2 of the state AGs are African American.
Right.
Georgia and Nevada. And so when he says my constituents, what I'm deciphering is that, you have these upper middle class or wealthy people whose maybe children have died from overdoses. And that's who he means by his constituents. But I guess it seems to me he's implying that since he didn't really get his dander up, or other state AGs didn't get their dander up over the crack epidemic, that blacks aren't their constituents.
Blacks are not their constituents. Their constituents are what we call academic activists. Academic activists are concerned with the legal precedent of the practices of law, what conservatives call governing from the bench. Activists, judicial lawyers, and judges. Conservatives call that governing from the bench. What this guy is talking about is if you can establish a legal precedent where the hand of law, aka government, is the primary reference point in legal settlements, that's very different than money back and forth being the primary reference point for legal settlement. So you have what's called activist judges and activist attorneys. They want the primary reference point to be the law and the interpretation of the law, not how much money somebody gets body slammed with in a courtroom. That's why they want that day in court, because only in court can the legal precedent be in language. It doesn't get put in language in a settlement.
Mm-hmm. Now, what do you say if I'm a parent in Georgia? I'm a black parent in Georgia, what do you tell them that
It's the same. It's the
because
same.
people can kind of see through it that it seems like there's a total disconnect between how state AGs react to the opiate epidemic versus the crack epidemic. Now you have policymakers even trying to decriminalize drugs, which African Americans were saying for years that it's a medical problem, not a legal problem.
That's correct.
Now you're seeing people react to it now that when people who don't look like us are now all of a sudden are affected by the crisis.
Not to mention methamphetamine, but we won't go there today, right?
Right.
So,
right. We don't have enough time. We don't have enough time. Is that illegal, by the way? Is that what you're trying to tell me?
No, I'm just going to tell you they're now waking up to it because it's impacting them. So
okay. When you say them, who you mean?
I mean middle class, suburban, and urban white folks.
Oh, okay. I thought I had some paraphernalia on my desk or something.
Paraphernalia.
I don't. Okay. All right. I'm good.
Sliding back. So what we have to tell our young people, man, our young black African American colored people, is that whether it comes at you with a suit and a tie on, or somebody who's wearing a collar, or whether it comes at you from somebody who's wearing a hoodie, it's the same harm and detriment. Whether you can buy it over the counter like you can a piece of candy, or whether you have to go down in the back alley in the dark and get it, it's the same detriment and harm. So our community nurturing values are critical and cannot be compromised by any venture at any cost. And we have to communicate that to them in their language.
I mean, are you willing to stand up for, I guess one of my overarching points, are you willing to stand up for issues involving African Americans, even though they may not be popular? Because this wouldn't have been popular to stand up for if you were a politician, necessarily been popular if you were a state AG or a politician decades ago on this issue that affected black folks.
Yeah, I'm willing to stand up for black folks' issues. That's why I'm an independent candidate. I couldn't speak like this if I was running for the Democratic nomination or the Republican nomination. There's no way in hell. So yes, I'm interested in staking my life on, have come to terms with my own humanity and existence as a black man at this point in history. And it is no longer a liability for me. It is a blessing. And to whom much is given, much is required. And what the universe has brought me through, I owe a big damn karmic debt. So yeah, I'm ready to pay it.
Okay.
Oh, I love to hear that. Love to hear that message. We're going to call you on this show, Governor Bartell.
I can't even vote in Georgia. I can't even vote in Georgia, but I'm a mail in. I'm a mail in something. I'm not even voting.
One of my questions as well is going back to the opioid crisis. Is there, I guess, what is the state coffers for allocations into the municipalities for treatment and prevention? Are there any particular, municipalities that are hit harder than others? One of the things, that you brought up, and we even saw that kind of corroborated by AP as well as New York Times, and really kind of, I think some of the numbers that were really coming out of Vermont and New Hampshire as how deep this epidemic went, that, the first time in history, you're seeing less white people be born, right? And one big proponent to that is overdoses. And then specifically that opened up the door to the methamphetamines, the opioid crisis, and everything else. So are there, understanding that argument with states' rights?
Yeah.
What is because, for those that may not be aware, watching, that even as a taxpayer, that, your first kind of loyalty is to the state. But let's be very clear that your money does matriculate to the federal government as well. Right. So even in the argument, that's where it gets a little murky. Between the state versus the federal government, Because for every dollar that you pay in taxes, a certain percentage of that, especially for homeowners, matriculates up to the federal government.
Right.
And most people are more familiar. Every time you pay in the Social Security, every time you pay your FICA taxes, and you get that paycheck, and you notice the difference between the gross and the net. So understand that even that argument by those that are yelling states' rights are also funding the federal government as well. So, one, I just wanted to make that clear for folks that may not understand that.
Sure.
But then two, now understanding that, are there any municipalities within Georgia that are hit harder than others? And if so, what has the state's response been? And I guess what would your response be to those municipalities that may not be aware that, hey, we actually just dropped, potentially a $300 million bag, a $400 million bag that could have gone towards filling some of these funding gaps that I'm going to assume some of these municipalities have.
Right. Well, when you take your question on face value, not the underpinning, but just on face value, it is designed inside of access to data and access to what's called institutional frameworks. So places like Atlanta, Charlotte, Chattanooga, Birmingham, New Orleans, those are beginning to be mega public health centers. So they have access to data. They can do education and awareness to mitigate some of the circumstances. But then when you get that second cut, like Birmingham, Winston-Salem, Danville, Virginia, right?
Second tier city. From where I grew up, actually.
There you go.
Like you've done your homework. So you've done your homework.
Yeah, cousin. And then you get outside of Austin, Texas, down by Amarillo, or on the other side of the east bank of Oklahoma. Those are rising little small towns who are now becoming cities, and they get just stripped of everything. The epidemic hits because they don't have the information, the data, and certainly don't have the superstructure to respond. Now, let's take the other part of your question about the states' rights. It is becoming increasingly costly to sustain institutional racism. So the institutional withholding of care from people of African descent, locking up people of African descent, the welfare system in a state can no longer afford the impact of withholding and controlling. So the cost of locking folks up is beginning to be such a burden on a state's budget that most conservative folks now are talking about alternative to incarceration. The most diabolically racist folks are talking about, if you educate them about health and make health care available, it is much less expensive than a multi-billion-dollar hit on medical institutions, hospitals, and so forth. So the silver lining in the toxic, murky, dark human spirit is that the cost of institutional racism is beginning to be too high. The last governor before Governor Kemp was a Republican governor in Georgia named Nathan Deal. He orchestrated a decreasing of the incarceration. The way we fund Medicare and Medicaid, the cost now is beginning to have people consider the Department of Public Health is leading with an education and awareness and prevention. So the cost of it is beginning to be so high, they got to look at other alternatives. We, as African Americans and black folks, it would be useful for us to engage with that with integrity rather than use it as another political marketing strategy. And that's going to be difficult for those of us who, quote unquote, made it to understand.
All right.
Okay. So, yeah, we're coming up on the hour. So, what did we miss? What didn't we ask that we should have asked?
Well, we should have asked, how come we as in black folks, ain't marching in the street, screaming at the top of our lungs, shouting 24 hours a day? How come we ain't doing that about black on black crime? That's the one we missed, cousin.
Well, that's a good point, but it's almost like trying to say that to move forward, you got rid your community of all crime, and no other community has that responsibility. That you have to rid the white community of all crime before you can get any policies passed, or you can move forward as a culture. But that's something that I don't think something that I think it's almost untenable to rid our community of all crime. But on that point, I think that there are rules and regulations that are no longer in the black community that used to be years ago. That certain behavior goes on today that would not have been tolerated years ago. My grandmother had a big switch. She make you go get your own switch. That type of control is not there anymore, and there are no more rules and regulations in the black community. And you have a breakdown of the black community, and it's real nuanced. But if there were rules and regulations, a lot of stuff would not happen. And I think you have people who take advantage of that. And it's nuanced. Where now our community has been so decimated that now we have people actually protesting for criminals. And we can't tell the difference between people who have actually been violated by the police and real criminals who actually committed a crime. So now you have us actually out on the street arguing for criminals. But I think there should be rules and regulations in the black community. It's something that we've talked about on our show. We're not necessarily, this is our way of shouting at the top of our lungs. We annoy people, but nobody can really beat us on the facts and the research. But this is our way of shouting at the top of our lungs instead of necessarily taking to the streets. But you're right, there are no rules and regulations in the black community that there used to be years ago, and other communities still have these rules and regulations. Things that happen in our community that would never happen in a white community or in an Asian community, or so on and so forth, because there would be some consequences.
Or a Muslim community? Oh,
right.
Man.
There would be some consequences, and nobody would call the police.
Yeah, exactly.
Follow?
I would definitely say so, because I was like, oh man, how much, when you asked that question, girl, I was like, how much extra time we get? You did some of it, Shock Exchange, with some of that layered nuance, because that could be a whole other show in and of itself. I will say though that I do disagree with the term black on black crime. Some of what Shock Exchange was stating earlier, simply because the term black on black crime came as it's almost like the one drop rule. It was specifically meant to disenfranchise black people. Yeah. So while I get the intention when people say it, like, oh, intracommunal crime, right. But we don't use white on white crime. We don't say Asian on Asian crime. We don't say, you know what I mean? So we don't say any other term but black on black crime, which kind of exudes its racist roots in the first place. So I just wanted to throw that out there, that I do disagree with the term, but I also agree with, and that's a square that I will forever die on, is that we can police our own communities. To me, it falls into that conversation, at least for me, and we've kind of contended offline with this a little bit between Shock Exchange and I, as I'm squarely for not just the message, but the act of defunding police, and not in the way that most people are kind of colloquially receiving it, meaning zero police. We shouldn't have zero police. Like, no, that's not what that means. That means that when Obama took, President Bush's $200 million budget and turned it into $20 billion, and all of a sudden we magically started getting militarized police, and we started magically getting no-knock warrants. In fact, I lay Breonna Taylor's death squarely on Obama's shoulders. It was specifically his policies. By allowing no-knock warrants, by allowing it to be a federal crime to assault a police officer, even in the midst of arrest, even in the midst of a wrongful arrest. It is a federal crime. And then you had his vice president buddy, who we just mentioned earlier, who was the one that increased federal mandates. So you already have someone that is fan the flames of institutional racism through privatized incarceration. And then you have Obama that is creating the situation and then also funding that situation. But we didn't see people in the streets when that asking, well, where did you get the other $19.8 billion to fund? Oh, it came from Medicare. Oh, it came from education. Like, there was no firestorm. There was no people in the streets when we were defunding education, because that's exactly where it came from. So when we say defunding the police, it means let's refund the social policies that are a foundation to a thriving community. Black communities are no different. Like, the melanin in our skin does not magically make us different from the same structures that are needed in order to have a thriving community. Education, whole families, as well as commerce. These are the structural pillars to any thriving community, and our community is no different than that. So for me, yes, I would love to see the police defunded in order to refund recidivism programs that could prevent some of these recidivism rates, as we noted earlier, with the incarceration rates amongst black males. Because when we talk about the decline of the black family, especially pre-1965, which I think we've addressed on this program before, you can almost follow year by year post-1965 through heroin, through the war on drugs, through mass incarceration. We are watching our families and our community be stripped of half of its human resource. And I don't care whether you're Jewish, whether you're white, whether you're Chinese. If I decide to strip your community of half of the resource, the human resources, if I take all the males out of the Jewish community, if I take all the males out of the Chinese community, and I imprison them, I hook them on drugs, I impregnate their women, I strip their schools of the resources and the teachers that they need to educate themselves, and then I give you 40 years, let's then check on you and see how well your community is going to be able to even hold on to its traditions that I think led to now what we describe as black on black crime, where we see over 70,000 black girls, for example, are missing right now, right this very moment. Yet my phone rarely goes off for Amber Alerts. The amount of black women and children that are missing in this country is asinine to me. The amount of black boys under the age of 12 that are committing suicide is asinine to me. And yet we have no, we have no kind of recourse for it. But these are the things that when we talk about black on black crime and essentially policing our own communities, where, years ago, kind of decades ago, the people you didn't touch, elders and children. Like, listen, you got some beef with a man, even if you're a woman of a certain age. But there were some rules. Right. There were some rules in the streets. There were some rules amongst working class, blue collar workers. And yet those tenets have and have been stripped, and we're just kind of left with what we see today. I didn't mean to get on my soapbox and go on that tirade, but as you can see, Governor, it's a matter that is near and dear to me. Because I care about us. I care about our community, and I do care about seeing it thriving and getting back to some of those principles and pillars where we were once thriving, even in the midst of racial terrorism prior to 1965.
Right. So, again, there are no rules and regulations in the black community like there used to be years ago when we were all growing up. And then when you attack the black male and you remove him from the community, then you have the community is vulnerable, and then you have the women and children have to defend for themselves. But I think it starts with voices like ours, because you don't hear our voices, particularly in the corporate media or in a broader environment. That's why we do this.
Well, that's the point that's being made, and the quote unquote evolving of an independent movement in America is we're beginning to consider we are not going to be able to go to a two-party system to restore the kind of balance that you're talking about.
Exactly. So one last parting shot, Mr. Mitchell.
I think my head is still in the last conversation, to be honest. One thing I will say, though, as a quick parting shot, because I thought it was a great point. Essentially, the cost of institutional racism. Citigroup, I believe it was Citigroup. Certainly, correct me if I'm wrong. That did the most recent quantifying of institutional racism at about $16 trillion, which interestingly enough and that only covers like the last 120 years, which interestingly enough was the same range of about 14 to $16 trillion that economists Sandy Darity as well as Derek Hamilton out of OSU came up with in regards to reparations and what that cost of reparations would look like for Black Americans of African descent. I guess that's my one last parting shot that yes, the cost of institutional racism is becoming unbearable. Go figure. Right. I don't think no Black person is surprised. But then two, just the kind of the tack onto that is that we are nearing 7% as a national average for inflation.
Right.
So when we talk about the cost of institutional racism, also is going to meet with the very real and tangible cost of inflation. Your groceries, your gas, and everything else, your clothes, housing is up nearly 30%. Rent is up over 13% on the national average. So in other words, it's going to cost you even more to be racist. So just so I guess some food for thought for the folks out there.
Right. I would just like to say that this has been very enlightening. We love to have you back, talk about the economy at some point. I think, the Obama administration created a economic picture, a picture of economic prosperity that did not include Black men.
Did not.
So, anyway, I think that's not what we're facing today. But we'd love to have you come back and talk about the economy. We'd love to have you come back anytime you want, but also just prior to the election to see where you are in terms of your policies and how the landscape is shaping up in Georgia, which is going to be a key race, I think, not just for African Americans, but nationwide. Everybody's going to have eyes on that election. So I just want to say on behalf of Mr. Mitchell, and this has been very enlightening. Thanks for coming and sharing your thoughts and your policies. I think we need to, as a community, to get your name and make sure you get your message to a broader audience. And so, for Trump and the GE, that's from Mr. Mitchell and Governor Bartell. Thanks for tuning in. Thank you.
You betcha. Take care now.
Thank you, Mr.
All right.